this challenge of extending your current CI practice to mobile. So what we've tried to do is, Uzi and I have the opportunity to work with a number of organizations. Perfecto Mobile, and I'll talk a minute about it shortly, has the opportunity to work with many large enterprises. And so as we work with large enterprises and we're focused in the mobile space, we frequently hear a few things, which is for our mobile application quality program, we'd like to bridge it into our CI practice. And many people are trying, and what we've observed is many people are complaining or are struggling in that process. And so that's what this presentation is going to focus on in terms of the observations or the challenges that we hear, as well as the solutions and best practices to overcome some of those. But before I start, let me get a sense of the audience. How many of you are today doing mobile programs? Great, so that's about half of you. For half of you that raised your hands, from an automation perspective, who has over 30% automation from a test perspective? Okay, so I'm sensing challenge number one. Okay, for those others, are you using real devices yet as part of your continuous integration process? Okay.
No.
So this level sets the audience right away. So the majority of you, and let me know here, are looking to learn, because it's on your roadmap to introduce real devices into your CI practice. Is that your number one objective, if you could just show of hands? All right.
Perfect.
Great. Great. So I think this is going to be a good presentation. As you plan out your process, you're going to hear a few tips that I think are going to be quite valuable to you. Let me first start off with this notion of time. If the intention or one of the primary benefits of continuous integration is quick feedback to the developers, I take a look at it as from a time budget perspective. What should I do when? How do I manage the time differences between, for example, build processes that are triggered on commit or on the polling basis that could happen several times a day? What happens overnight and what could happen from a weekly test perspective? And from our perspective is that you want to maximize the amount of feedback, actionable feedback in terms of defects observed or potentially performance degradation, and bring that fast into the organization, back to the dev team. And as we take a look at it, we start, of course, with acknowledging the importance of doing the basics, which is unit testing, and getting that unit test coverage as fast as possible. But then it goes into understanding, well, with a larger time budget, what part of my test suite can I introduce into the both nightly and weekly process? So I want to keep that notion of time present throughout the conversation. So as an overview, we're going to talk about some of the challenges with regards to bringing testing, mobile testing into the CI practice. We're going to talk about a working pattern that we've seen as for organizations who perhaps or might be a couple steps beyond where you are today. They're still perfecting it, but I think there's some definite examples learned, and we have some examples on that. And then hopefully you're going to walk away with some best practices that you could bring home and try to smooth out your journey. How many of you are familiar with Perfecto Mobile? A few. All right. And for the guys in the cloud bees in the back, thank you. So the Perfecto Mobile, just a word, our focus is enabling organizations to perform test automation and monitoring, as well as providing a hosted cloud facility of real devices. And the big emphasis is really on real devices. And I say that from the perspective of, from a logic perspective, emulators are great, but our focus is really from a mobile perspective. And the good news for us is we've been around for 10 years. We actually have an established track record of working with organizations increasingly focused on agile processes. Let me start off with hopefully something that's familiar to everybody. I think it was back in 2006, in that neighborhood, or maybe a little earlier, where Mike Cohn really started popularizing the test automation pyramid. And I think there's, it has a lot of merit in terms of the conversation, but what we have observed is that when you start taking this idea, which was really built around from a web perspective, when you bring it into mobile, there are some differences. And this actually begins to change the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect. So before I drill down to technical ideas and technical suggestions, I just want to tell you a little bit about my day-to-day. Every day I have 90 minutes commute to work, and during the work I'm having the train, and I'm doing the following. So I'm using checkbooks, Facebook, of course. I get a lot of notification about those, and I reject it. I watch my YouTube video, clear some emails, return to Facebook, answer a phone. Remember, it's a phone. And this is what I'm doing on my Nexus device. And we have Carlo. He's doing the same, but he's an iPhone guy. So suddenly, if you're thinking about your application needs to handle all these situations on different devices with a different network. Think about it. I'm in the train, so the network is actually changing. So now when you are thinking about mobile, we are not just thinking about testing my mobile in a clear environment, but we are thinking about more devices, different network virtualization, other events like call, SMS, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly this very good automation methodology is not works anymore for mobile. And why? Because suddenly we need to add more devices. I need to run on my test on 10 devices, 20 devices, okay? And then suddenly I have the environment parameter. For example, 3G, 4G, rotate the device. It's a very simple action, but affects most of the application. By the way, I'm talking about application and responsive web design. Both are very important to test on all the devices. And on top of that, we have a performance issue, and we have a security test that we need to run. So suddenly, our tests that we used to run during our CI, which was mostly unit tests, are not good enough for web and mobile. And how are we going to solve this? How can we execute UI tests on real device, as part of our CI process? So let's talk about what are the challenges, and then try to understand how to solve it. So the first thing is we are hearing our customers and our partners that are struggling to add real devices. And why? First of all, if you have one tether device that you add to your laptop and you run some automated test on it, you cannot build a full CI on top of this because it's not stable. Where you are going home, the device will not be connected. So the devices are not there, are not available. And the device readiness, think about it. You have a lot of events as part of the device. You need to connect it to the Wi-Fi. Maybe you need to connect it to a different action. It's not easy to have the device ready and available. Ready and available. So what are the solutions? First of all, you must have a lab. Lab means devices or emulator available for you all the time. And the idea, or the most important, that when we are talking about the lab, is the SLA. Why? Because if you are running 10 builds a day, you must the devices to be available for you. And if you have two devices and one of the manual testers use one of the device, and you cannot run the build on top of this, it's a problem. You don't have a real CI. So in order to have real CI, you need to have a lab, and you need to have SLA. And why lab is so important? As I mentioned, SLA, I also want to introduce the parallel execution. When you have lab, you have a large number of devices, you can execute the test on all of the devices on the same time. And of course, different devices. Let's talk about the different devices. So this is how it works with Perfecto. And what we are doing in Perfecto, we are support standard remote WebDriver. So what we have in Perfecto Mobile, we actually support capability, the standard capability of Appium or Selenium. What we are adding here is which device do I want. I would like to execute my test on Android with version 5. Something. I would like to execute my script on iOS, which is located in Canada. And what happened right now, this property, this capability will send to Perfecto Mobile Cloud with the test itself, and we, the cloud itself, will provide you the required device. So right now, the devices with the specific property will be available for you. Another thing that I'm hearing a lot, and this is based on what we had in the past. In the past, most of our test was manual, maybe UFT, very easy to implement. Right now, when we are talking about development, it's hard. It's a new language. It's a new skill set that need to be developed. It's also, the maintenance is not easy. This is what we are hearing from our customer. And our suggestion is the following. First of all, and the most important thing is the easy object identification. It means that most of the automation at the end will be based on the way that you identify the object, right? So how do you have easy object identification? By having collaboration between the developer and the tester, and you are, as the build manager, need to help them to build this communication, they can create an object with ID, which makes the automation very easy, which make it very robust, which makes all the builds to pass, and you don't going to have false negatives, which is our worst enemy if we are talking about the build environment. Another very important thing is develop a framework. Find a team with a strong development capability and ask them to develop the framework. And separate the framework from the test itself. I saw a lot of examples like this. I would like to share one of you. So this is an example for an infrastructure. So first of all, you can use the BDD, which is define your test in English. I'm in the login script, enter my credentials, click on the login button. And then, so this is done by the product owner. And then we have this type, and this is something really important. This is just a JSON which identified all the objects in the screen. So I have the ID, I have my name, my last name, and my email. These are the 3 fields that I have in my form, okay? And another important thing here is that the type used is ID. Why? Because I have a good relationship between the tester and the developer, so each object contains an ID. And at the end, this code generated automatically. So the tester will write this definition, the infrastructure or the framework will generate the code. So in this case, you will be able to create a lot of tests easily. And now there are different implementations. I saw implementation is in XML, and I saw implementation on Excel. The tester write the test in Excel, automated script generated and created Selenium script. So this is a good practice. Why? Because it helps you to have one strong team of developers that actually maintain the framework, and the tester can create a lot of tests and increase it and manage it and maintain this. So what does it mean that build good XPath? And you can see here an XPath as example. So this is Starbucks application, and you can see the developers, the Apple developer and the Galaxy developer or the Android developer are not working together. And it looks different. So let's think about the first login action. The first login action that I need to implement is actually find the object username or find the object username and email and enter the email, right? So now if I need to run one test, I'm in a problem because I need to have 2 different identification. So try to use and smart XPath. In this test, or in this case, I use the contents. And I said, find the element, find the text field which contains the username. And then it works on both of the application. So it helped me to create the right XPath. It's very clear. It's very robust. And more important, it's actually cross-platform execution. This code, this line, will enter the value, my email, into both of the devices, iPhone and Android. So I have one code that works on both of the platforms, yes. But the most important thing here, when you create automation and you don't have an ID, try to find the smart ways to identify and to have the XPath, and try to have one code that works on both of the devices. This is classic. I arrived to a customer. Most of our customers, so we arrive into a customer that running, yes, that's a good point. So there are two options. One option is—
Can you repeat the question, Uzi?
So if you have a page object methodology, and then you have two different paths based on what you learn, what should be the next page and how to manage the next page. So there are two options. One option is actually to think about transactions. So the page object will be transaction related. So you are going to have the path, and all the data will be, or all the tests will be in one class per transaction. This is one option. The other option is to have the next page as part of the parameter which arrived. So you are running the test, and based on the buttons that have been pressed, or based on the data that enter in this specific page, you are invoke the next page, and it can be different page. So in the page object, when you have the path, when you have the conditions, just implement both of the way. And if you don't have the notion at the beginning of the test, what you need to do, you need to have a generic data that get all the page using the get all elements, and getting the array and run on the array, and that will be totally dynamic code. But it's need to be smarter because you need to understand or to analyze the path based on the object that you got from the get elements command. So I'm returning into here. So we are arriving to customers that using Selenium, runs it on web, and now they want to expand it to mobile. And then they told me that I have 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 scripts, and I have 25% of error. And if you have 25% of error from 4,000 scripts, you're not getting any benefit from automation. Why? It takes a lot of time to analyze the script. Better to have 100 test cases that you know that work than 4,000 test cases with 25% of error. So why? And there are two or three main topics. First of all, I'll start with the environment readiness. Sometimes the environment is not really ready. Remember, when we are running the test on the real devices, when we are running the test on the mobile, it actually runs end-to-end. It's not just a unit test that we control all the parameters. It's actually related to the other component, and it's dependent on the database and on the APIs. So the most important thing is to have a readiness of in the before test run a readiness function, which checks that everything works. Just try to do something very small. If it will not work, do not continue with your test. That's one thing. Another thing is based on the test itself. If we are talking about mobile, there is a lot of issue with the device. Suddenly you have a pop-up that the network is not available. Suddenly you have a call, SMS, some kind of this. So you need to implement an error handling mechanism. The best practice in Perfecto Mobile is the following. When you have an error, try to get another device, execute it again, and if you have the same error, just then notify it. Just then break the build. Don't break the build automatically. And this is an example for error in Perfecto Mobile. So I mentioned we are talking with, this is a Java code, but we can work with any other language. And what I have here, I have three layers. First of all, I'm looking for the, on error, I'm looking for message box with, or button with OK. Why? I have a lot of pop-up with OK or cancel. So this is called the system level control. I can get the button or the message from the device itself. It's external to my application. I press the OK button. And then if it does not work, I'm going to close and open my application and restart the test. And then I have, if everything does not work, I can restart the device or get the next available device. Okay? Remember, when we are working with browser, when we are working with real devices, we need to have an extra test, an extra functions before we are sending an error to our build machine. Why? Because it can be the environment, it can be the device. Check it, test it, and then just notify the error. Questions? So we talked about the devices, the development, the execution, and now the error handling, and now let's talk a little bit about the execution. It takes a lot of time. Real devices, cloud, how to improve it. So yes, it always will be slower than local browser on your machine. That's true. But if you will be able to use and parallel execution and said, OK, I would like to execute my script on 10 devices, and it's going to run on the 10 devices, you solve the problem. For example, I had customers that execute 25 tests in 40 minutes, and he need to reduce it. So what we did, we just added more devices to the cloud. And now each test, the test actually split between the devices, and we actually runs in a shorter windows. Another thing is the best practice. For example, don't use a wait. Wait is a bad practice. Use a synchronized element. Wait for something to be happen. Identify the object, or know what are the objects that you are looking for, and wait for the object. And then it helps you to create a better flow, a better script. And best practice, we in Perfecto Mobile, we have something called community.perfectomobile.com. We have a lot of code samples that said, this is better than this one. Use XPath with, use ID and not XPath if you can't. Use an XPath with content and not relative XPath. All this data is actually, all these tips will help you to create a better script. You have the option to improve your script. It's like a database that you can improve your SQL the same way. Good practice, good code will create a good SQL. So what I want to show you here is two options. First of all, manage the timer, change the timer as part of the script. The two first line, you can change the timer during the script. If you know that you have something that you need to wait only 5 seconds, change it to 5 seconds. And then after that, return it to 30 seconds. Everything based on your need. Another thing that I think is very, very important is actually the parallel execution. What I did here, I actually used testng. I believe most of you are using testng. So I decided to use the parallel execution, and I'm providing the device property as a property or as a parameter to my test. So now my test is going to get 4 devices and going to run on 4 devices. By the way, on top of this, we have another layer that said, OK, you want to execute your test on 4 devices, 1 iPhone, 1 Android, 1 tablet, and 1 Chrome, which is a PC, laptop. And if in the cloud, let's say you have 3 tests. If in your cloud you have 3 iPhones, the 3 tests will run on, each test will run on different iPhone, and you'll get all the reports into one centralized mechanism. So we have, they execute all the tests on a different device on the same time. And if it's the same device property, it's just going to help and execute part of the tests. Any questions about the techniques and about the cloud? OK, for more details, if you want to see more code example, we are actually in booth number 3. You can in front of this door.
Also, Uzi's also doing a lightning talk at 12 o'clock, where he's going to go over a few specific examples in terms of best practices that are posted right now in our community. What I want to do is come back in terms of this conversation about time and managing the time budget from a feedback loop perspective. And one of the things that we've worked with customers out is how to plan out that schedule and have a test strategy that dovetails into the CI cycle. And specifically trying to understand, one of the best practices we observe, Uzi kind of touched on, is understanding the test suite, but not monolithically. Breaking apart that test suite into a variety of test groups where you're able to identify what your priority transactions are. What are you going to do, for example, in every build? What are you going to do periodically in terms of the cycles, for example, from a weekly or a nightly perspective? Another aspect of that is from a performance perspective. We are very strong proponents of trying to introduce performance testing earlier on in the process from a feedback. And by performance testing, I want to make sure we separate the idea of load versus all the rest of the aspects that you could learn from performance testing. For example, one of the things that you're able to do early on is simply embedding the notion of timers, or, for example, specifically looking for breakage due to timeout failures by actually extending some of the transactions. But really trying to understand your test strategy and being able to optimize it from a durations perspective. I was speaking to another group last week where they were talking about, on average, the target for their organization was to strive to automate automated test iterations that are about 1 to 2 minutes per test case. But then, as taking a look at managing all the outliers and aggressively trying to bring those outliers down to that 1 to 2 minute range. So therefore, they can maximize the executions they're able to include. One of the things that, and I think Uzi touched on almost all of these aspects in the conversation, is really making sure that there's a clear test plan for it to support the CI perspective. And we look at it as a cookbook in terms of the elements that need to be in place for the process. You know, Uzi mentioned, for example, the page object model as one of the design patterns that we see as particularly effective for organizations in terms of being able to maximize the amount of reuse that's occurring, and therefore being closer and closer to getting automation built into Sprint Zero, and therefore getting that feedback loop going. It also has to do with changing the mindset in organizations where, for some organizations, manual is simply the default approach to thinking, but obviously to bridge to a CI pattern is obviously going to require moving to manual testing as the exception and automated testing as the norm. In addition is the idea that we started back, if you kind of remember Uzi's slide earlier with regards to the commute, is being able to think not only in terms of executing the functional test of the transaction, but understanding the transaction in the context that users are actually experiencing, and being able to factor in user conditions into the conversation. What happens, for example, to a transaction when the battery's running low? What happens to the transaction when the network is moved from LTE to 1G, for example? How does that impact the transaction? And being able to include that. And one of the things that we touched on earlier in the conversation was we touched on one example of the dev QA collaboration around object identification. But it really starts very early in the process in terms of understanding that, breaking down that wall that has frequently separated QA and dev. And so trying to move to a close before a couple of examples is the notion of being able to share the tools between dev and QA, being able to start from the same IDE that the dev team is using that the QA could be using. For example, if it's a Java Eclipse environment, then Java Selenium makes a great starting point from a QA perspective. In addition, being able to, over time, developing that coding best practices. Coding best practices, for example, in terms of being able to always have a strict kind of definition in terms of object naming conventions, as well as being able to understand that XPath to hand it over. What I have there is on number 3 is that POM maintenance or page object model maintenance, or with regards to whatever the test framework that you've built out, being able to manage that as well from a staffing perspective. We've seen the shift that's occurring as the QA team becomes increasingly technical, teams becoming able to specialize who's actually building scripts, who's actually maintaining and building out that framework. Uzi provided several great examples with regards to essentially dynamically managing errors or notifications during the test, and being able to reduce the breakage that occurs during automation of that test. One of the things that we didn't talk on, and it's an example that I'll draw in a moment from one of our customers, is as part of the build itself, before launching the main suite of tests, actually being able to do a readiness check to confirm whether all the web services are there, confirm, for example, that the device is actually ready in terms of being able to do a rollover to a second device, as an example. And of course, Uzi talked about parallel execution. One of the conversations that I always include to underscore in this is the notion of that culture matters. A lot of the change that we've been talking about, and obviously for a conference like this, with the conversation with regards to Agile and being able to move to a CI pattern, is also changing the way people think. And so I always include that this as a plug to make sure that we not only have the tools conversation and the techniques conversation, but to keep the people in mind. From a point of view of trying to wrap this up before I provide two specific customer case studies to draw the conversation to a close, is really trying to understand how does this test automation that we've been talking about and real devices fall into the CI pattern itself. And so what you're seeing here in this depiction is being able to, for most organizations, the common flow, but from dev through their source control, their build process either managed by Jenkins or other tool, that are then launching the Perfecto test automation as one of the jobs in the build process. And with that, being able to execute A, on real devices, B, in parallel to optimize around the time, and then finally to get the reporting to get to actionable defect remediation. One of the things that we particularly stress is being able to understand is to lower the number of defects that declare non-reproducible by dev, and making sure that there's a clear step-by-step in terms of where the failure occurred, video to understand exactly where in the application it occurred, as well as including both application level as well as device level vitals in the report to make sure that the dev has the opportunity to aggressively attack that defect that's been reported. This is an example of one of our customers who's actually doing CI on a nightly basis today, and they're actually transitioning to being able to do it multiple times during the day. This is an organization that you see that there's not a lot of activity from a unit test because they're relying on third-party dev. But one of the things that I think is, I always highlight as a key best practice for what they do is that at the start of their build, as they transition into the test portion, they're actually doing a series of pre-readiness checks that I discussed earlier. And therefore, the idea is to minimize the false positives that are just triggered by the environment, failures that are triggered by the environment and not by a failed transaction itself. And so, in fact, that's one of the key aspects that they're doing. And then secondly, what they're focusing on right now is being able to reduce this approximately 3.5-hour cycle. And their goal is to be able to compress this to about a 90-minute cycle so that they could run it throughout the day. Their first goal from a daily execution perspective is to be able to run it in the morning and then run it in the afternoon to get kind of inside the day feedback. A second customer of ours is Rabobank in the Netherlands. And this talks about the process that they are going through right now in terms of they've built this out as their roadmap for their CI practice. And being able to use it as an example of where they ultimately want to go is that they're moving towards a continuous delivery objective. They've defined for themselves that their goal is to have the capacity to do 10 releases in a day. 10 releases in a day. And that's not what they're anticipating actually doing, but it's in terms of how they're sizing their team and scaling their process to deliver the business agility, that they need for their organization. And what they've done here is actually in terms of being able to not only build out this pattern, but also understand it from a build perspective of how they're traversing their 3 different test environments, from dev to QA, and then they have an acceptance environment for their business. with that, we want to draw this conversation to a close and take any questions that you had. But what we've tried to do in this presentation is walk through some of the specific challenges that we've heard our customers express as they've tried to introduce real devices and test automation into their CI practice, and shared with you a series of best practices, and then concluded by saying that we're working with customers who are actually successful at this and are actually maturing their implementation. So take hope, it's possible, but definitely apply the best practices that you've heard us share, as well as I'm sure others share.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.